I was 22 at the time, traveling alone by bus through the Midwest. It was the summer of 2014, and I had just graduated college, determined to explore the country a bit before diving into the job market. My plan was simple: visit small towns, see the sights, and maybe write about my experiences. I didn't have much money, so I stayed in hostels or slept on buses between stops. On that particular day, I was heading to a small town called Rockville, and my bus connection left me waiting for hours at a tiny stop in the middle of nowhere. The bus stop was nothing more than a wooden shelter with a bench and a roof to keep off the rain. Around it was an abandoned gas station, a seemingly endless road, and sprawling fields that stretched out to the horizon. The only other person I had seen that day was an older man with a grim expression who had boarded a bus earlier. As the sun began to set, the sweltering heat of the day gave way to a cool breeze that made me pull my jacket from my backpack. The next bus wasn't due for another 3 hours, and I was already bored of music and scrolling through social media with the terrible reception. That's when he appeared. A tall man with messy hair and a scruffy beard, walking down the road with long, deliberate strides. He wore a worn-out denim jacket and had a backpack slung over one shoulder. He looked out of place, like he didn't belong there, but his friendly expression disarmed me at first. "Hey there, waiting for someone or just passing through?" he asked, flashing an easygoing smile. I was caught off guard by the question, but I figured he was just trying to be polite. I told him I was waiting for the next bus, and he nodded, as if deep in thought. "I know this area like the back of my hand," he said, dropping his backpack to the ground and sitting on the bench next to me. "If you're heading somewhere nearby, I could give you a ride, save you the trouble of waiting out here in the middle of nowhere." The offer seemed generous, but it was also a little strange, considering I was a complete stranger. At first, I politely declined, saying I preferred to wait for the bus, but he kept insisting, his tone friendly but oddly persistent. He guaranteed me he knew a perfect shortcut to Rockville. That's when I started to feel uneasy. There was an odd mix of excitement and urgency in his voice that I couldn't quite place. I hesitated, but the uneasiness began to grow. He seemed overly friendly, almost forced, and while nothing about him was explicitly wrong, something about the situation made me want to keep my distance. Still, maybe out of politeness or not wanting to seem rude, I kept the conversation going. He started asking questions that seemed harmless at first: where I was from, where I was headed, why I was traveling alone. I answered vaguely, trying not to give too much away, but he didn't seem to mind. He kept filling the gaps with comments like, "You're brave to be out here alone," or "You don't meet interesting people like this every day." After about 20 minutes of chatting, he tried again. "Seriously, I can get you there in no time. There's no one else on the road at this hour, and I swear you'll feel safer in my car than stuck out here by yourself." He gestured toward a car parked a little further down, partly hidden behind the abandoned gas station. It was an old sedan with peeling paint, and something about the sight of that car gave me chills. The idea of getting into it with a man I had just met felt insane, but at the same time, I wasn't sure how to refuse without upsetting him or showing I was nervous. I kept running scenarios in my head about how to get out of the situation without making things worse. "I really prefer to wait for the bus," I said finally, trying to sound firm. He frowned for a second, but then smiled again, as if trying to reassure me. "All right, suit yourself, but if you change your mind, just let me know. I'll be waiting in my car." He stood up, grabbed his backpack, and started walking back toward the sedan. Each step he took away brought a small wave of relief, but something about the way he turned his head before getting into the car made me freeze. His face had changed for a split second, like the friendly mask had slipped. It was just a flicker, but it was enough to send a chill down my spine. After he got in the car, I sat on the bench, trying to act calm, but every cell in my body screamed at me to stay on high alert. He didn't start the engine. He just sat there, parked, with the headlights off. For a few minutes I tried to ignore it, pretending to scroll through my phone, but the feeling of being watched was suffocating. I glanced sideways out of the corner of my eye and saw that he was staring in my direction. I don't know how long this went on, but it felt like forever. The sky was beginning to darken, and I felt completely vulnerable, alone in that place. While the car stayed parked there, my discomfort kept growing. I couldn't stop thinking about everything that could go wrong. What if he was waiting for me to let my guard down so he could catch me off guard? What if he wasn't alone? I looked around, but the place was completely deserted. The wind rustled the tall grass around the stop, and the only light came from a dim bulb hanging from the shelter's ceiling. I tried to convince myself that he might just be a weird but harmless guy. Still, my gut was screaming at me to stay on high alert. Suddenly, the engine roared to life. The sound echoed in the emptiness, and my heart started pounding. I thought he was finally leaving, but instead, the car began to creep forward, circling around and stopping closer to the bus stop. Now it was only a few yards away, the engine humming softly and the headlights still off. The driver's window rolled down, and he leaned his head out. "Are you sure you don't want to ride? It's getting late, and I'd hate to leave you out here all alone." His tone was polite, but there was something different in his voice now, a sort of restrained urgency. I tried to refuse again, keeping my tone as casual as possible. "It's okay, the bus should be here any minute," I said, trying to sound confident. He stared at me for a few seconds, as if analyzing my response, then let out an exaggerated sigh. "All right then. But I'll hang around until the bus gets here, just to make sure you're safe." He smiled, but there was something unsettling about that smile. It didn't feel like a gesture of kindness. It felt like someone playing a game with rules only they understood. My throat felt dry. My phone battery was almost dead, but I started typing a message to a friend, telling them where I was, just in case. Time seemed to crawl by. The car stayed parked, the engine still running, and I could no longer hide my nerves. Suddenly, he got out of the car. My whole body froze as I watched him walk toward me, his hands shoved into the pockets of his jacket. "Look, I've been thinking," he started, stopping just a few steps away from me. "I know you're cautious, but I promise there's nothing to worry about. I'm just trying to help." His voice was calm, but his eyes, there was something cold and empty in them that left me speechless. That was the moment I realized I had to act before the situation spiraled completely out of control. I stood up from the bench, trying to appear confident, even though my heart was racing. "Thanks for the concern, but I'm actually really close to where I need to be," I lied, hoping he would believe me. He raised an eyebrow, clearly unconvinced. "Really? Because there's nothing around here for miles except empty fields and open roads. Where are you headed again?" His tone was casual, but the intent behind the question was clear. My stomach knotted. I needed to get out of there somehow. "Just to the next village," I replied quickly, pointing in the opposite direction of his car. "I think I can walk the rest of the way before it gets completely dark." He looked at me for a long moment, his lips tightening, as if weighing his options. "Well, good luck then," he finally said. But he didn't move. Every part of me wanted to run, but I knew that if I showed panic, he might react unpredictably. I grabbed my backpack, slung it over my shoulder, and started walking slowly down the road, forcing myself not to look back. With every step, I expected to hear his footsteps following me, but all I could hear was the hum of his car engine still running. After a few minutes, I turned my head slightly, just enough to glance over my shoulder. He was still there, standing by the bus stop, watching me. Then I heard it. The car suddenly roared to life and began to move, slowly following me down the road. That sound of tires on the cracked asphalt snapped me out of my trance. I started running without looking back, my feet pounding against the ground, and the weight of my backpack pulling me backward. I spotted a dense patch of overgrowth on the right side of the road and dove into it, weaving through bushes and trees. Branches scratched at my face and arms, but I didn't care. I just kept running, leaping over logs and ducking under branches until the sound of the engine finally faded into silence. After a while, I stopped to catch my breath, realizing I was surrounded by complete darkness and open fields. My chest heaved as I tried to calm down, and I crouched low, finding a spot where I could see the road from a distance without being seen. Not long after, I saw him driving slowly, as if searching for something, or someone. I stayed there, frozen, for what felt like hours. Eventually, he sped up and disappeared in the opposite direction. When I finally felt it was safe, I made my way back to the road and kept walking until I found a gas station with its lights still on. I explained everything to the clerk, who let me wait inside until the next bus arrived. To this day, I don't know what would have happened if I had accepted that ride. But one thing is certain, I'll never ignore my intuition again. Josh and I always had this habit of hitting the road without much planning. It was kind of therapeutic, escaping the noise of the city and losing ourselves on lesser-known roads. This was back in the fall of 2018. I remember it well, because the leaves were just starting to change color, and the scent of burning wood seemed to linger everywhere. We were driving through rural Tennessee, the kind of place where road signs are rare and you see more loose chickens than people. Our plan was simple: drive until the gas tank ran low, find a spot to camp, and call it a night. But that night turned out very differently than we expected. We stumbled upon the state park almost by accident after driving down a narrow road surrounded by massive trees so dense they almost blocked out the fading daylight. The park's entrance was modest, just an old sign with peeling letters. There wasn't anyone there, no ranger, no other cars, just silence. Josh looked at me and said, "Perfect, let's camp here. Who's gonna bother us in the middle of nowhere?" At the time, I thought it was a great idea. But now I question every decision we made on that trip. After parking near a small creek, we set up our tent. The place had this strange beauty to it, almost unsettling. The trees seemed to lean in, as if they were trying to hear what we were saying. Josh got a fire going while I studied the park map, trying to find a cool trail to explore before it got dark. There was one that caught my eye. It started about 10 minutes from our campsite and supposedly led to an old fire lookout tower. Watching the sunset from up there sounded amazing. We grabbed our flashlights and started walking, completely unaware of the sinister turn our evening was about to take. We walked for about 20 minutes before the trail started getting harder to follow. The ground was covered in wet leaves, and the sunlight was quickly disappearing behind the branches. That's when Josh suddenly stopped and pointed his flashlight to the right. Through the trees, we could see a tent, half collapsed, with belongings scattered all around. At first, I thought it was just some camper who forgot to pack up, but as we got closer, I realized it wasn't that simple. The tent was torn open, like something, or someone, had forced their way in. Clothes, cookware, and even an open backpack were strewn across the ground. It looked like whoever had been there left in a hurry and didn't take anything with them. Josh started poking around, curious as always, while I stood there with this weird feeling in my chest. It wasn't just the abandonment of the site that bothered me. It was how everything seemed off. The dishes still had dried up food on them, and the backpack was full of essentials like a wallet and IDs. Who leaves stuff like that behind? Then Josh found something even stranger, a diary, slightly dirty and with some crumpled pages. He handed it to me, saying, "Maybe this will explain something." But as I started reading, the discomfort only grew. The first few pages were normal. Someone describing their trip, the park, the trails. But then, the tone shifted. The last entries were short, hastily scribbled. The writer mentioned hearing strange noises at night, footsteps around the tent, and the constant feeling of being watched. One line in particular sent shivers down my spine. "I know I'm not alone here. Something is following me." The date on the page was just a few days ago, but it didn't make sense. The food at the site looked like it had been sitting there for weeks. Josh tried to laugh it off, saying it was probably just someone paranoid, but I could tell he wasn't as relaxed as he was pretending to be. The forest was eerily quiet, as if even the animals had decided to stay away. We decided to head back to our campsite and leave the whole thing behind. On the way back, the uneasy feeling only got worse. The sky was pitch black by then, and the only light came from our flashlights. That sensation of being watched grew with every step. Josh cracked a few jokes to lighten the mood, but I knew he was tense too. When we finally reached our campsite, something felt off. The fire we had left burning was completely out. Our backpacks were scattered, their contents spilled all over the ground, just like at the other site. My mouth went dry instantly. Josh muttered a curse under his breath and pulled out a pocket knife, like that would be enough to protect us from whatever this was. As we scrambled to gather our things, we heard it. At first, it was subtle, rustling leaves, snapping branches, like something was circling us. Josh's flashlight swept across the woods, but there was nothing there, just trees and shadows. He whispered for us to stay quiet, and I nodded, barely breathing. The sound got closer, heavier, like footsteps moving slowly but deliberately. To this day, I can still remember the raw, primal fear I felt, the kind that freezes every muscle in your body. Then, suddenly, the noise stopped. A suffocating silence followed, and then, out of nowhere, something dropped from the trees, landing near us with a heavy thud. It was a backpack, the same one from the abandoned campsite. When I saw the backpack lying there on the ground, I almost stepped back, but my legs felt like they were glued in place. Josh was quicker. He grabbed the backpack with shaky hands and opened it, like he was bracing for a bomb to go off. It was the same backpack we saw at the abandoned campsite, with the same IDs, the same clothes, everything identical. But there was one difference. Something new had been stuffed inside. A piece of paper, folded and crumpled as if it had been shoved in there hastily. Josh pulled it out and showed me. It was a handwritten note, scrawled in big, uneven letters. "You shouldn't be here." Josh tried to keep his cool, but his voice cracked when he said, "We need to get out of here, now." I didn't argue. We grabbed our stuff and started taking the tent down as fast as we could. My eyes darted around the forest, scanning for anything, or anyone, that might be watching us. Every sound felt magnified. The wind in the trees, the crunch of our footsteps, even the sound of my own breathing felt too loud. When we finally packed everything up, we started walking back to the car. But as we moved, we realized the sound of footsteps wasn't just ours. There were others. They came from behind us, then from the side, then in front. It was like we were being surrounded, but no matter how hard we looked, we couldn't see anyone. Josh gripped his knife tightly, and I clutched my flashlight like it was a weapon. We practically sprinted the last stretch to the car, and Josh was already unlocking the doors when something made us stop. Across the clearing, right where the trail began, there was a figure. It was tall, completely still, and it seemed to be watching us. We couldn't make out a face, just its silhouette framed by the trees. "Get in the car," I whispered, not taking my eyes off it. Josh hesitated for a second, but did as I said. I jumped in after him, and he started the engine. But as the headlights lit up the trail, the figure was gone. "I swear it was right there," I muttered, and Josh just replied, "I saw it too, just drive." We sped out of there as fast as we could, but the feeling of being followed didn't go away. Every time we glanced in the rearview mirror, it was like something was moving in the shadows, keeping pace with the car. I only started to feel safe when we reached a more populated area with streetlights and cell service. Even then, that night has never left my mind. To this day, I wonder what happened in that park, who wrote the diary, and what exactly was watching us. We never went back to Tennessee, and we never went camping again. Whatever was out there didn't want us there, and it made sure we got the message. I remember that day vividly because everything seemed perfect. until it wasn't. It was the summer of 2019, and I was on a road trip through Colorado with two friends, Eric and Amanda. We'd planned this trip to escape the noise of city life and explore the quieter, scenic mountain roads. We rented an SUV packed with camping gear, snacks, and a cooler that kept clunking loudly with every sharp turn. Music blasted from the speakers as Eric sang off-key, making Amanda threaten to cut the Bluetooth. It was one of those carefree days where nothing could go wrong, or so I thought. Around 3 in the afternoon, everything began to shift. I was driving along a winding, deserted road surrounded by towering trees that looked straight out of a postcard. It was breathtaking, but also eerily isolated. For miles, we hadn't seen another car, a gas station, or even a sign pointing to the nearest town. That's when we saw him. A man standing by a car with its hood open, smoke curling lazily into the air. He was waving his arms desperately, like someone who had been stranded for hours. Amanda was the first to speak. "Do you think we should stop?" Eric shrugged, but I felt a knot forming in my stomach. There was something off about him. He wore a heavy, worn-out jacket that didn't make sense in the summer heat, and his old baseball cap looked like it had been through decades of wear and tear. Even from a distance, he gave off an unsettling vibe. But it's hard to ignore someone in need when they're in the middle of nowhere. Reluctantly, I pulled over and rolled down the window. "Hey, everything okay?" I asked, already regretting it. The man approached quickly, and that's when I noticed just how out of place he looked. His skin was pale, almost sickly, and his eyes were sunken, giving him a hollow appearance. His energy was erratic, like someone teetering on the edge of panic. "Oh, thank you so much," he said in a raspy voice, panting as if he'd run to us, though he hadn't moved. He explained that his car had broken down and he needed a ride to the nearest town. No phone, no idea where he was exactly. Without hesitation, Eric opened the back door. "Hop in, we'll get you there," he said. The moment he got in the car, the atmosphere changed. It felt heavier, more oppressive. He sat in the middle seat between Amanda and Eric, fidgeting with his hands and glancing out the window every few seconds. "Thanks for this. You guys are lifesavers," he said, but there was something about his tone that made my skin crawl. His voice was low and almost sluggish, and he avoided making eye contact with me through the rearview mirror. Amanda tried to make small talk, asking where he was from and what he did for a living, but his answers were vague and curt. "Far away," was all he said when she asked where he was from. I focused on the road, but every word out of his mouth made me more uneasy. Then, out of nowhere, he started saying strange things. "Have you ever heard about what lives in these mountains?" he asked, letting out a soft chuckle that didn't sound like a joke. Eric, trying to lighten the mood, replied, "What, just bears and wolves, right?" The man's face turned serious, almost offended. "No, there are worse things here." He leaned forward slightly, so close that he was nearly between Amanda and me, and added, "There are places where people vanish. No one ever finds them." A shiver ran down my spine. I forced a nervous laugh, trying to break the tension. "Well, I hope we're not headed to one of those places." He just gave a faint, knowing smile, like he was in on some dark secret. The carefree vibe of our road trip had been replaced by an unbearable silence. The only sounds were the hum of the engine and the occasional rustle of wind through the trees. After a few minutes, he began rummaging through the backpack he'd brought, slowly unzipping it in a way that caught my attention. "What are you looking for?" I asked, trying to keep my voice casual. He didn't answer right away. Instead, he met my gaze through the rearview mirror, his eyes blank, and said, "Nothing you need to worry about. Yet." That's when Amanda made up an excuse to stop the car. "We should stretch our legs, right? It's getting kind of cramped in here." I knew she just wanted a reason to get that guy out of the car, even if only for a few minutes. I pulled over at a small clearing on the side of the road, just a patch of dirt surrounded by dense trees. When we stepped out, he stood by the car, staring up at the sky like he was deep in thought. "Do you feel that?" he suddenly asked. Feel what? Amanda replied, crossing her arms. He pointed toward the forest. The silence. That's not normal. At first, I thought he was being dramatic, but then I noticed it too. There were no birds, no rustling leaves, no sound at all. It was like the world around us had gone on mute. Eric laughed nervously. It's just because we're out in the middle of nowhere, dude. Relax. But the man kept staring into the trees, squinting like he was trying to spot something hidden. When he finally spoke again, his voice was barely above a whisper. You're lucky you don't know what's out there. By now, Amanda was getting impatient. Okay, I think we've stretched enough. Can we keep going? Everyone seemed relieved by the idea of getting back in the car and leaving that spot behind. But just as we were about to get back in, the man made a comment that sent a chill down my spine. If I were you, I wouldn't stay on this road after sunset. He looked directly at me, his lips curling into that eerie half-smile. That's when things come out. I tried to brush it off with a forced laugh. Well, good thing we're not planning to hang around. But deep down, I was starting to regret ever stopping to help. We got back in the car, and the silence that followed was unbearable. Nobody knew what to say, and I could tell Amanda and Eric were just as tense as I was. The man, on the other hand, seemed oddly at ease now, like he was enjoying the uncomfortable vibe. After a few minutes, he spoke again, this time in a casual tone that only made it worse. Did you know there's a stretch of this road where people just disappear? Cars left behind, belongings still inside, but no bodies ever found. He said it like it was some creepy campfire story, but the way he delivered it made my stomach churn. That's when I noticed the gas gauge. We were running low. The needle was hovering just above empty, and the next town was still miles away. I tried to stay calm, but the situation felt like it was spiraling out of control. When I mentioned it, the man chuckled softly, the kind of laugh that sends chills up your spine. You shouldn't have stopped. They like it when you stop. Amanda's eyes widened, and she looked at me with pure fear. Eric tried to play it cool, saying we'd make it to the town before the gas ran out, but I wasn't so sure anymore. As we drove on, I started noticing something strange about the road. It felt like it was stretching endlessly. Every curve gave me a sense of déjà vu, like we were driving in circles. The man had gone quiet, but there was a faint smirk on his face, like he was waiting for something. Amanda finally broke the silence. Did you see any signs? Shouldn't we be close to the town by now? I didn't know how to respond. Everything outside looked the same. Identical trees, identical bends in the road. Even the sky seemed darker than it should have been for that time of day. Eric suggested pulling over to check the GPS, but I refused. If we stop again, I'm not sure we'll get out of here. My tone sounded more desperate than I intended, and it made everyone even more tense. That's when the man started murmuring to himself. He wasn't talking to us, just muttering in low, disconnected words that I couldn't make out. Can you speak up? Eric asked, trying to sound calm, but his voice wavered. The man turned to him with a dead serious expression and simply said, "They're already coming." My heart was racing, and I wasn't sure if I was more afraid of him or whatever he claimed was coming. Then Amanda screamed, "Look over there!" Up ahead, on the side of the road, was another car pulled over with its hood up, smoke drifting lazily into the air. But there was no one around. I slowed down as we passed it, my stomach sinking. "Is that the same car?" Eric asked, his voice shaky. No one answered. Just the thought of it being the same car we'd seen earlier was enough to make my head spin. The man chuckled again, softly, and said, "I told you this would happen." That was it for me. I slammed on the brakes and whipped around to face him, my blood boiling. "What the hell are you talking about? Who's coming? What's happening here?" He looked at me with that unnervingly calm expression, as if my anger didn't faze him at all, and replied, "You've been marked. There's no escaping it." Before any of us could react, he opened the door and stepped out, walking toward the trees without saying another word. "Hey, you can't just walk off!" Amanda shouted after him, but he didn't look back. Within seconds, he disappeared into the forest, leaving us alone on the road. When he vanished into the trees, the silence returned. But this time, it wasn't just uncomfortable. It was suffocating. Nobody said a word for a few seconds. Amanda was visibly shaking, and Eric just stared at the forest, as if expecting the man to come running back. "We need to leave. Now," I finally said, my voice trembling more than I wanted it to. I turned the car back on and pressed the gas, desperate to put as much distance as possible between us and that place. But something was wrong. The GPS, which had been working earlier, now showed nothing, just a blank screen, as if we were in the middle of nowhere. "This doesn't make sense," Amanda whispered, staring at her phone as though willing it to work. I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched, even though I couldn't see anything beyond the trees. Every shadow between the trunks seemed deeper, darker, like it was hiding something waiting to pounce. Then, I noticed something in the rearview mirror. A figure. It wasn't clear, but it was tall, thin, and walking straight down the road behind us. "Do you see that?" I asked, my voice barely audible. Eric whipped around so fast he almost hit his head on the window. "See what? Where?" When he looked, the figure was gone. The tension in the car was unbearable. Eric suggested stopping again, but I snapped. "Do you want to end up like him? We're not stopping." Amanda was sobbing now, trying to muffle her cries with her hands. I was doing everything I could to stay focused, but my eyes kept flicking to the fuel gauge, which was now flashing red. The tank was almost empty. Then it happened. The car jolted violently, and the engine started sputtering. "No, no, no!" I yelled, slamming my fist on the steering wheel, but it was no use. The car rolled to a stop, and the oppressive silence swallowed us once again. We sat there for what felt like an eternity, too scared to even breathe. Eric tried the ignition, but all it did was make that dry, lifeless clicking sound. Amanda pointed toward the forest. "There's something out there. I swear I saw something move." My blood ran cold, but I forced myself to stay calm. "We're staying in the car. Nobody gets out." But whatever was out there didn't seem to care. The sound started faint and rhythmic, footsteps crunching on dry branches, circling the car. Every time I tried to pinpoint where it was coming from, it seemed to shift, as if it was toying with us. The footsteps grew louder, closing in on us. Amanda was crying uncontrollably, and Eric stared out the window, his hands gripping the seat like he was bracing for impact. I clutched the steering wheel, my knuckles white, as if holding on to it could somehow keep us safe. Suddenly, the car shook violently, as though something massive had slammed into it. Amanda screamed, and Eric lunged forward to manually lock the doors. My mind was racing, but all I could think was that if we stepped outside, we wouldn't survive. I looked into the rearview mirror, and for a split second, I saw it. The same tall, shadowy figure, now much closer. It had no face, just a dark, featureless silhouette, but it was watching us. My entire body froze. Eric's voice snapped me out of it, yelling, "Try the engine again!" I turned the key, and to my relief, the car roared to life. Without hesitation, I slammed on the gas, the tires skidding as we sped away from whatever was out there. The car bounced along the rough road, but I didn't care. Amanda was sobbing, Eric was silent, and I couldn't stop looking in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see that thing chasing us. After what felt like hours, we finally saw lights ahead, a small gas station at the edge of the forest. We pulled in and parked under the fluorescent lights, which felt like a shield against the darkness. None of us spoke as we got out of the car, still shaking. Inside, the gas station attendant, an older man with a weathered face, gave us a curious look. "You came from that road, didn't you?" he asked, gesturing toward the direction we'd just come from. I hesitated before answering. "Yeah, why?" The man shook his head slowly, his expression grim. "People say that if you stop on that road, something marks you. You're lucky you got out." I wanted to ask more, to understand what he meant, but he just shrugged and walked back to his counter like it was something he'd seen too many times to bother explaining. To this day, I don't know what we encountered on that road. I don't know who or what that man was, or what was watching us from the forest. But one thing's for sure, I'll never stop to help a stranger in the middle of nowhere again. It all happened in July 2018. I remember it so clearly because it was the summer before our last semester of college, and we just wanted to end that phase of our lives with something epic. There were 5 of us in the car: me, Amanda, Josh, Brian, and Emily. We decided to hit the road to Las Vegas, leaving San Francisco for a trip we'd never forget. I was the designated driver most of the time because I loved being behind the wheel, but all of us were excited, taking turns with the playlist, cracking jokes, and even playing silly games to pass the time. Everything felt perfect until we stopped to refuel at one of those isolated gas pumps in the middle of nowhere. The place looked like it was straight out of an old movie: a rusty gas pump, a half-fallen sign barely lighting up the surroundings, and an older man with a scruffy appearance sitting in a lawn chair, sipping a soda. He had the kind of face that looked like he'd been born there, in that dust, and never left. When I went to pay for the gas, he struck up a conversation and asked where we were heading. When I mentioned Vegas, his eyes lit up for a second. That's when he suggested a shortcut through the desert. He said it was faster, had incredible views, and would be an unforgettable experience. I hesitated, but the rest of the group thought it was a fantastic idea. After all, what harm could a beautiful scenic route and saving a few hours cause, I thought. At first it seemed like he was right. The back road was much less crowded, and the sunset reflecting off the sand dunes created an almost magical landscape. We were laughing, taking pictures, and even talking about how brilliant it was to take this path. But as time passed, the GPS started acting up. At first, it stopped calculating the remaining time of the trip. Then it got stuck on a single point. That's when we realized there was no cell signal either. Not even AM radio worked, and the only sounds we could hear were the muffled hum of the engine and the constant wind, which seemed to grow louder by the minute. When the car started sputtering, I felt a chill run down my spine, but I tried to play it cool. "Probably just sand in the filter or something," I said, as if I knew anything about cars, which, to be honest, I didn't. The problem wasn't just that it sputtered. It stopped entirely. In the middle of a road that seemed to stretch endlessly, with no signs or hints of civilization nearby. We got out of the car and looked around. Nothing but sand and a straight line of worn asphalt. That's when the silence started to feel strange. It wasn't just quiet. It was as if the desert itself was watching us, waiting. While Brian and Josh tried to check the car engine, with little success, to be honest, the rest of us stayed close to the vehicle, trying to keep calm. Amanda was cracking jokes to lighten the mood, but you could see in her face that she was scared. Emily, who was always the most rational among us, was unusually quiet, staring at the horizon like she was searching for some kind of landmark, but there was nothing. "We just need to wait for another car to pass by," I said, trying to sound confident, but something told me no one would be coming through. It had been nearly an hour since we last saw another vehicle. Did the old man at the gas station mention that? I couldn't remember. The sun had fully set by now, and the desert at night was an entirely different world. The temperature dropped rapidly, and the wind started to kick up small grains of sand that rattled against the car's body, creating an irritating and constant noise. That's when Amanda screamed. She was pointing at something on the horizon, a light. It was faint, flickering, but it was there. All of us turned to look, and without hesitation, we grabbed our flashlights and started walking. "It could be a house or a ranch," Brian said, trying to sound optimistic, but to me, it felt more like a trap. I can't explain why, but my stomach churned with every step we took. Walking through the desert at night is a surreal experience. The silence feels heavier, almost oppressive, and every sound, whether it's the rustle of sand or the crack of a dried-out plant, seems amplified. The light remained in the same spot, as if it was waiting for us. "Why doesn't it seem any closer?" Emily asked, her voice trembling. She wasn't wrong. It felt like we'd been walking for a good 20 minutes, but the light didn't appear to be any nearer. That's when Josh tripped over something. He fell face first into the sand, and when we looked down, we saw it was a piece of wood, a stake. But the weirdest part was that it was stuck in the sand with a rope tied around it, as if someone had deliberately placed it there. Amanda started to panic, saying it was a sign that we needed to turn back. I wanted to go back too, but Brian insisted we were already halfway there and that it would be worse to turn around. I hated to admit it, but he was right. The light was there, like a promise of help, but everything inside me was screaming for us to stop. We kept moving, and that's when we heard the first sound. It was distant, almost like a murmur, but loud enough to make us freeze. We stood in silence, our eyes meeting in the dark, until the sound faded away. It wasn't the wind. It wasn't the car. It was something human, or almost human. From that point on, the light on the horizon felt more like a warning than a promise. Every step we took, the murmuring sound grew clearer, but it still seemed to move around us, coming from different directions. Emily began to cry softly, clutching her flashlight so tightly that her hands were trembling. I was trying to keep my cool, but my heart was pounding in my chest like it was about to burst. "This is crazy, guys," she said. "We should go back." The problem was that when we turned around, the car had disappeared into the complete darkness. There was no longer the comfort of a way back, just sand and shadows shifting wherever our flashlights pointed. That's when we saw something in the sand. It wasn't another stake, but rather a trail of footprints crossing our path. Human footprints, but strangely deep, as if whoever left them was carrying something heavy or walking in a bizarre way. "This is getting way too weird," Josh muttered, trying to sound brave, but his voice betrayed him. We followed the footprints for a few meters, and they simply vanished, as if the person had evaporated into thin air. The silence became unbearable again, and this time, none of us even tried to speak. It was as if we all felt that speaking too loudly might attract something we didn't want to meet. Finally, the light seemed closer, but now we could see it wasn't a house or a lighthouse. It was something smaller, a rusty metal structure standing in the middle of nowhere, like an old pole or an abandoned antenna. As we approached, I realized the light was coming from a flashlight hanging off the structure, swinging slightly in the wind. Brian was the first to get closer and took the flashlight to examine it. "It's still on, but it looks like it's been here a while," he said. There were scratch marks on the flashlight and what looked like dried blood on its side. Before anyone could respond, we heard footsteps. They weren't ours. The sound came from all around us, circling. We frantically looked around, aiming our flashlights into the shadows, but there was nothing there. Just the sound of footsteps crunching in the sand, growing faster and closer. Amanda started screaming, and Emily grabbed my arm so tightly that her nails dug into my skin. "Run!" Brian yelled. But where? The desert felt infinite, and every direction seemed just as bad. The light from the flashlight we found began to flicker, and that's when we saw it. A tall, hunched figure with unnaturally long arms standing just a few feet away. It didn't move, it just stood there, watching us. Just long enough to make my blood turn cold. No one knew what to do. We stood frozen, paralyzed, as the thing stared at us. What terrified me the most wasn't just its distorted appearance, but the way it tilted its head, almost like it was curious about us. Josh finally broke the silence with a desperate scream and started running in the opposite direction. That snapped the rest of us out of it, and we all started running too, but the thing didn't stay behind. The footsteps that had once surrounded us were now directly behind us, fast, as if it were playing some twisted game of chase. Amanda tripped and fell, and I swear I'll never forget the sound of her scream as we turned to see it getting closer. Brian and I managed to pull her up just in time, but the weight of the moment crushed any chance of thinking clearly. With every step, it felt like the desert was swallowing us whole. The air seemed thicker, like breathing took effort. Our flashlights began to fail, and the only thought in my head was, we're not getting out of this. Then, in the middle of the chaos, we saw another light. But this one was different, brighter and steady. I couldn't tell if it was real or just our desperation playing tricks on us, but we ran toward it like our lives depended on it, because they did. As we got closer, the figure seemed to hesitate for a moment, almost like it didn't want to step into the illuminated space. We finally reached the light, which was coming from an old truck with its headlights on. There was a man standing beside it, holding a shotgun, his face a mix of relief and urgency. "Get in now," he shouted, and we didn't think twice. We piled into the back of the truck as he kept his eyes locked on the desert. When the thing finally got close enough to the edge of the light, it stopped. It just stood there in the darkness, as if it knew it couldn't step any further. I'll never forget the way it watched us. No eyes, but full of intent. As the truck roared to life, the thing stepped back and we drove away. The man didn't say much as he drove. When we finally reached a main road, he dropped us off at a gas station and left without explaining anything. We tried asking where he came from, what he knew about that thing, but all he said was, "You were lucky tonight." His face showed nothing but exhaustion. When we returned to the car the next day with a tow truck, the mechanic said there was nothing wrong with the engine. It ran perfectly, as if it had never stopped. To this day, none of us talk much about what happened that night. I've never gone back to the desert, and I've never trusted shortcuts again. Sometimes in the silence, I still hear those footsteps behind me, a reminder that some things in this world aren't meant to be understood. That night felt like any other road trip. It was early August, and the four of us, me, Emily, Josh, and Claire, were driving back home after a long road trip through Arizona. I was behind the wheel of my old Honda Civic, a car that had seen better days but never failed us. The road was practically deserted, lined with cacti and dry bushes that were barely visible in the dark. The only sound was the faint music playing on the radio. We were tired, but still chatting about what we'd do once we got home. It was around 1 a.m. when the flashing lights appeared in the rearview mirror. Red and blue, unmistakable. "Great, what did I do this time?" I muttered as I slowed down and pulled over onto the shoulder. As soon as the car stopped, the mood inside shifted. Everyone fell silent, trying to figure out if we'd been speeding or if something was wrong with the car. Claire, sitting in the passenger seat, leaned forward and whispered, "This is weird. We haven't seen another car for miles." Josh and Emily, sitting in the back, didn't say a word, but the tension was thick. The vehicle behind us came to a halt, its headlights glaring into the car, making it hard to see anything outside. I'd been pulled over before, but something about this situation didn't sit right with me. Maybe it was the time of night, the isolation, or the way the vehicle had appeared out of nowhere, but my instincts were already on edge. The man stepped out of the vehicle slowly, as if he wanted to make sure every movement was noticed. Even in the dim light, I could make out his tall, wiry frame. Something about him seemed off. His uniform didn't look quite right. It was slightly faded, almost as if it had been secondhand. When he finally approached, I noticed he wasn't carrying a flashlight, which struck me as odd for a traffic stop in the middle of the night. He tapped on the driver's side window with his fingers, and I hesitated before rolling it down. "License and registration," he said in a deep voice. But there was something off about it. It didn't sound authoritative. It sounded rehearsed. I reached for the glove compartment, trying to stay calm. When I handed over the documents, he barely glanced at them. Instead, he stood there, his eyes scanning the car's interior like he was searching for something. Claire lightly gripped my arm, her nails digging in just a little. He finally broke the silence. "Do you know what you did wrong?" Before I could answer, he continued, "Driving these roads at night can be dangerous. You never know who you might run into." The way he said it sent chills down my spine. He didn't sound like someone warning us for our safety. He sounded like someone enjoying our unease or testing us. "I was just trying to get home, sir," I replied, trying to keep my voice steady. He didn't answer immediately, tilting his head slightly, as if studying my reaction. Josh, in the back seat, broke the silence, speaking in a low voice. "This feels wrong, man. Something's off." I felt the same way but didn't want to add to the panic. The supposed officer took a step back, still watching us, and said, "Step out of the car, all of you." I froze. Why was he asking us to get out? Normally, officers told you to stay in the vehicle. "Why?" I asked, trying to sound calm. He didn't like the question. His expression hardened, and he leaned closer to the window. I said, "Get out, now." Emily was visibly nervous and whispered, "Don't do it. Don't get out of the car." I wanted to listen to her, but the man had this way of making it seem like he was used to being obeyed. Even so, something inside me screamed not to trust him. Still, I hesitated, my hand hovering over the door handle. That's when I noticed something that made me stop. The badge on his uniform was crooked, poorly sewn, as if it had been slapped on in a hurry. And his vehicle, it looked oddly generic, with no department markings. My heart started racing. It was like the illusion he was trying to create was starting to crack. "Look," I said, trying to sound reasonable. "If we did something wrong, we can sort it out here. There's no need for us to get out." His frown deepened, and he gave a small, unsettling smile. "That's not how this works, kid. Get out of the car now, or things are going to get a lot worse for you." Something in his tone made it clear he wasn't bluffing. Josh, from the back seat, murmured, "Lock the doors, now." Without thinking, I hit the button to lock the car. The sound of the doors clicking shut echoed in the tense silence. The man immediately changed his demeanor, slamming his hand against the window harder. "You think that's going to help? You better do what I say." The tension was unbearable. He started walking around the car, dragging his fingers along the metal, mumbling something we couldn't make out. The flashing lights from his vehicle only illuminated parts of the shoulder, leaving most of the area shrouded in darkness. Every step he took seemed to press down on us, like the air itself was heavier. Emily was clutching my arm now, her fingers ice cold. "This isn't normal. This isn't a cop," she whispered, her voice barely audible. The feeling of being hunted was overwhelming. Then he stopped, standing directly behind the car. Whatever he was planning, I knew we had to act fast. "What now? What do we do?" Josh asked, his voice barely above a whisper. I had no idea. The only thought running through my mind was that we had to get out of there. But how? The man was standing behind the car, and through the rearview mirror, I could see him staring intently into the vehicle, like he was trying to decide his next move. I leaned forward slightly and pressed the button to turn off the interior lights. Darkness enveloped us, except for the faint glow of his vehicle's flashing lights. "If he's not a cop, he won't shoot," I whispered, trying to convince myself. But was I really willing to gamble all our lives on that? Suddenly, he started speaking, but not to us. He was talking to himself, muttering disconnected phrases that only made the situation more surreal. They always think they can get away. They don't know anything. Nothing. I could barely breathe. He was clearly unhinged, and now he seemed to be enjoying the fear he was causing. Claire pulled out her phone, trying to call for help, but there was no signal. Of course there wasn't. We were in the middle of nowhere. The man returned to my side of the car, but this time he was holding something. It was hard to make out in the dark, but it looked like an old flashlight with a cracked lens. He shone it into the car and said, "Want to play hide and seek? I can promise it won't last long." My body was in full fight-or-flight mode, that kind of primal alertness you feel when you know something terrible is about to happen. "Start the car," Emily whispered. "Just start it and go." I hesitated, knowing that if I made a move, he might react too quickly. But then, as if he could hear our plan, he stepped back and yelled, "Come on, make this fun, try to run." The laugh that followed was the most unsettling sound I've ever heard. It wasn't genuine, it was animalistic, forced, like he didn't even know how to laugh properly. At that moment, something snapped inside me. I knew that if we stayed, there would be no way out. I turned the key in the ignition and slammed on the accelerator before I could think twice. The car jerked forward, the headlights catching the man for a brief second before he disappeared into the darkness. He didn't try to stop us, didn't run after us. He just stood there, watching. The road felt narrower than before, and I was driving so fast, the car shook with every bump. Claire kept looking back, expecting to see those flashing lights in the rearview mirror, but nothing appeared. "Do you think he let us go?" Josh asked, his voice trembling. No one answered. The silence in the car was suffocating, broken only by the hum of the tires on the asphalt. We drove for almost an hour without stopping. None of us could relax, as if the danger was still following us, even though there was no sign of the vehicle. Finally, we spotted a brightly lit gas station, an oasis in the middle of that desolate road. I pulled up near the pumps, and we all got out quickly, like the inside of the car had become unbearable. Emily went straight into the convenience store, while Josh and Claire stayed near the car, nervously looking around. I leaned against the hood, trying to catch my breath. The hot desert air felt heavier, denser. That's when I noticed something strange. Our license plates were covered in what looked like dried mud. I went into the store to tell Emily and ask her to grab some water to clean the plates. But when I got there, she was already on the phone, talking to the local police. "It's him," she whispered to me as she covered the receiver. "I'm explaining everything." I waited, listening to her describe the man, the uniform, the unmarked vehicle. When she finally hung up, her expression was even more tense. "They said there were no patrol cars in this area tonight, and worse, they said this isn't the first time they've gotten a report like this." My stomach turned. Had other people gone through this? And if they had, what happened to them? When we got back to the car, an older man who worked at the station called out to us. He had a calm demeanor, but there was something dark in his eyes. "You need to stay on the road and drive straight to the next major intersection," he said, his voice firm. I asked why, but he just shook his head. "People like him, they don't stop, no matter where you are." His words echoed in my mind as we got back into the car. No one argued. We did exactly what he said. The gas station lights faded behind us, and the road was swallowed again by darkness. We made it home by sunrise, exhausted and still trying to make sense of everything. We tried telling friends and family, but most didn't believe us. Some said it was just a corrupt cop. Others thought we were exaggerating. But I know what we saw. I know what we felt that night. We never found out who he was or what he really wanted. But since that day, I've avoided driving on deserted roads at night. And every time I see flashing lights in the rearview mirror, I can't shake the chill that runs down my spine. I can't help but ask the question that will never be answered. What if it wasn't just a man? What if it was something much worse?